each of the members. Their performances, we will take some questions from the audience. At this time, I'd like to remind everybody to silence all cell phones and pagers so they don't go off. Today on our panel, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Joseph Fletcher, a professor of medical ethics, pastoral theology, and Christian ethics who chaired Martin Luther King Jr.'s doctoral committee. We also have Clarence Taro, a famous American lawyer and author. Also on our panel is Sir Winston Churchill, a British statesman and Prime Minister. And also today with us we have Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States, who... Okay, we're going to begin today by having Sir Winston Churchill.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is always a pleasure and an honor to speak in the United States, and I dare say I am humbled by the company of this panel. Before I make my remarks today, I should probably point out why I'm so unkempt. Now, finding myself retired, I have decided that not shaving is a lot funner than shaving. So, if you will, and excuse my unkempt appearance, I do apologize. However, I'm retired and I don't care. Also, I find two things that I was unaware of when I arrived here, that one of which I like a great deal, that thing called a mocha, which I see many of you drinking. And secondly, which I was unhappy to hear, that I cannot smoke my cigar. I hope you don't mind, I'm going to hold it. It makes me feel better. As I look out into the audience today, I'm reminded of a letter I wrote my younger brother Jack on my first trip to the United States in 1895. In it I wrote, and I quote, and I'm cheating, I'm looking at my notes. It was a long time ago. This is a very great country. There seems to be no such thing as a reverence for tradition. Everything is eminently practical. Things are judged from a matter-of-fact standpoint. In the years since then, I've reflected upon that many times, and I have seen no reason to change my opinion of the United States. Given the time constraints each of us is speaking under today, I shall limit my remarks to a few thoughts on the unbreakable bond shared between the United States and Great Britain as demonstrated in the late war. I find myself uniquely qualified to speak of this bond because I am of a mixed background. For those of you who aren't aware, my mother was an American, and my father was a descendant of one of the greatest Englishmen, the Duke of Marlborough. Thus, I can say I embody the greatest of the English-speaking world in one spelt form. Ever eager to enjoy life, it might be best to explain my arrival here today by looking back at my arrival on the planet. I was born prematurely November 30th, 1874, at my grandfather's Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, England. He was the 7th Duke of Marlborough. My dear mother had been attending a ball that evening and was not expecting my arrival for 2 months. However, as I had shown throughout my life, I like to get the ball rolling. As was the custom of that age and of the people of my family's status, I and later my younger brother were sent to boarding school. I went to the English boarding school, Harrow. Not one of the top ones, but a good one. Where it might be politely stated that I excelled in getting in trouble. And mathematics and history, as well as English. Not so much the classical languages, which I retook in 1995. If you will excuse my saying so without any false bravado, I achieved a great deal of success as a junior officer during my brief military career. While serving in India, the Sudan, and later as a reporter and eventually a volunteer officer in the Boer War in South Africa. At each place and at each time, I achieved merit and warranted the positive comments of the officers that were my superiors, including Lord Kitchener, who would eventually be under my command. During the later war, I was captured, but made an escape across the hostile and desolate lands of South Africa. Based on that and later experiences in the Boer War, I wrote 2 books, which gained me a great deal of fame during the war years, in some sense, in Great Britain. In fact, I had, and up to this point, have written a number of books, and on an occupation, I much enjoy and find a great deal of success in, culminating in 1953, when I was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. However, I digress. In 1900, I won a seat in Parliament. And today, just over 50 years later, I remain a member of that great democratic body. In the following years, I held many cabinet offices, and including First Lord of the Admiralty before and during the early years of World War I, ending that war as Minister of Munitions. For a brief time, I held the post of Secretary of State for War and Secretary of State for Air. I can justifiably say that I was one of the early advocates of air power, and am probably responsible for England's adherence to the great few I shall mention later, the British Royal Air Force. I should take a moment here to mention that in 1908, I married Clementine Hosier. I wouldn't want her to be mad. And that our union was blessed with 5 children. Our daughter Marigold did not live beyond the age of 3, so we had 4 to make it to adulthood. 3 daughters and my son Randolph. In the interwar years, life in the political arena was less exciting for me. However, I was one of the few voices that understood a danger was posed by the growing German militancy. Finally, after my predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, committed Great Britain to a policy of appeasement in the face of mounting German aggression, which proved to be a monumental blunder, King George VI, in all his infinite wisdom, asked me to assume the role of Prime Minister, which I did in May 1940. This brings me to my remarks today, and they shall be brief. I wish to offer a few comments about the importance of the stand of our 2 great nations, your nation, the United States, and my nation, Great Britain, to preserve democracy during the late war. Although it is true that it took precious time for the United States to come to the aid of the old world, we in Great Britain knew that the United States was the giant waiting to be awakened. Without doubt, it can be said that the moment of truth came as a Nazi wave crashed against the shores of Great Britain, defended by the brave few, the pilots of the Royal Air Force. And there we stalled Nazi Germany, waiting for the United States to find its way into the war. The staunch defense of our island not only stalled the Nazi plans, it gave the American citizenry and its politicians enough time to realize that this was their war as much as it was ours. Yes, it is true the direct American military intervention did not come about until after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. A foolish and blunderous move, I might add, which awakened the colossal forces of the sleeping giant that is the United States. However, prior to that time, my good friend President Roosevelt had been for some time sending material aid and money to aid us in our effort to stem the tide of fascism. One cannot overestimate the importance of such strong ties during the darkest days of the 20th century. The friendship between President Roosevelt and myself was unbreakable, just as the friendship between the United States and Great Britain was also equally unbreakable. Just as I offered my countrymen blood, toil, tears, and sweat in 1940 as I assumed the prime ministership, I pledged the same to your Congress in December 1941 after the Japanese had attacked your naval forces at Pearl Harbor. And I'm happy to say they accepted my offer with men, money, and undaunted determination to see a victory come to our forces around the world. And by our forces, I mean the forces of democracy. Later, as the United States entered into the war fully, I made the decision that your General, Dwight Eisenhower, should be the supreme Allied commander, placing the forces of Great Britain under his command. Although highly unpopular among many British military officials and some citizens, it was the right decision to make. For its part, American workers made thousands of planes and tanks which would find themselves piloted or driven by Britons. Such teamwork, whether it be the British giving their command over to the Americans or the Americans giving us their material, money, and manpower, is what was required to defend democracy against the onslaught of fascism around the globe. We entrusted each other with the responsibility of defending evil and upholding those things which we held most sacred, and which, rightfully, we did. Perhaps no better example can be shown than to consider that Great Britain was home to over 1 million Allied personnel prior to the D-Day invasion at Normandy. And rather than lead to wariness between the English civilians and those Allied forces, most of whom were American, I am proud to say that we Britons were grateful, if not bountiful hosts. As the war dragged on, I am happy to say that the bond between America and Great Britain did not break as Hitler had anticipated. Through perseverance, our two nations proved there is no threat that we cannot meet together, no enemy we cannot defeat, and that as long as there is an England and a United States, the light of democracy shall never be extinguished. This was our legacy to the future generations, and this was our responsibility. I understand some of your historians and news people refer to the generation that won the Second World War as the greatest generation. Well, I'm not one to quibble. I was a little bit old for that generation. That aside, the bond between the United States and Great Britain in the face of any challenge to democracy shall remain unbroken. Wherever democracy is challenged, as we learned in the Second World War, the United States and Great Britain will confront it jointly together, and we shall never fail. This failure is unacceptable, and as the British showed during World War II, we will never surrender. Now I'm going to conclude my remarks, perhaps prematurely. As I step away from the podium today, I want to leave you with one last thought. We Americans and Britons can look back at the colossal struggle between fascism and democracy that was the Second World War with pride and say to each other that indeed, and indeed the world, that this was our finest hour.
Thank you. And next up is Dr. Joseph Fletcher.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for having me at your school here to speak. My name is Dr. Joseph Fletcher. Move these. I'm here to discuss with you today some of my studies that I have come to over, well, my lifetime, from around the 1920s when I was just a teenager, all the way through present day. I suppose I'll start with my education. I am a graduate of the University of West Virginia, the Berkeley Divinity School, and also London University. I've spent the majority of my life and my time teaching theology, mostly at the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I've really enjoyed teaching. I have my entire life. Along with teaching, I've had the great pleasure of speaking at around 500 venues around the world. Much of them include universities and schools, much like this one. And I've done this in about 15 different countries. So that's opened me up to different cultures and different religious aspects as well. Kind of the funny thing about attending all these venues and seminars is that I find myself invited to these, and I sit there, and there's the older chairmen, and they come up here and they give their bibliography somewhat, and I sit there and kind of think that it sounds to me a little bit more like an obituary than a bibliography. And as sad as it is, I find myself to fit into that category a little more often than not. I did the majority of my work alongside teaching, and my studies consist mainly of ethics. The different ethical fields that contain are bioethics, medical ethics, Christian ethics, along with others, and also situation ethics, which that is what I am mainly here to talk to you about today, for the main reason that it was probably the most impactable. Situation ethics is comprised of a kind of a collaboration of ideas and theories, along with other collaborations of philosophers throughout my lifetime. And it's dramatically changed my lifestyle and my way of living. Although throughout my lifetime, the role of religion in my life has dramatically changed, I still feel that it's a very strong contributor to situation ethics. I like to open the discussion of situation ethics with a little joke, just to kind of lighten up the what can be kind of a heavy subject. And the joke starts like this. There was once a very wealthy man, and he went out at night, and he approached a female, and he says to her, "Would you like to come back to my place and sleep with me?" She says no. He goes, "Well, what if we considered it $100,000? Would you come sleep with me?" She says, "Yeah, I'll do it for $100,000. He says, "Well, how about $10,000? She says, well, yeah, I'll do it for $10,000. He says, "What about $500? She's like, "What do you think I am?" He replies, "I think we've already cleared that up. Right now we're just negotiating on the price." In my view, there are only three approaches to moral decisions. The first is a legalist approach. By the legalist approach, it basically means that our decisions are based on a strict rule, that it gives us directives to be followed by. The second approach would be that of antinomian. By antinomian, it's the exact extreme opposite of a legalist approach, in that basically decisions are based on absolutely no rule whatsoever, and it's a completely unprincipled approach. And then thirdly is the situational approach. The situational approach basically says that morality is an act is a function of the state at the time in which the decision is made. Basically, at the time when the decision is made is one of the main points of situational ethics. Situation ethics does not try to state whether there are universal truths or not. That's not the point of the situation ethics. The point is to consider the time in which the decision is taking place. There's only one real rule in situation ethics. It's the intrinsic value that love is the most important value, specifically agape. This is simply the fact that one is to make the most loving decision in any situation. In this light, there are some situations where most loving decisions may be made, and to a legalist, it may be an immoral act. There's the classic situation of, could you kill an innocent child to save the lives of millions of people? Or maybe in a more applicable real-life situation, if you had the opportunity to kill Adolf Hitler and in turn save the lives of millions of innocent Jews. Another situation is that of a man escapes from an asylum and he has an intended victim to kill. He comes to you to ask where the intended victim is. Now, by the legalist approach, by telling the man where his victim is, only one sin has been committed, and that's that of murder, as opposed to lying to him and then two sins have been committed. Obviously, you can go on and on with situations, and there's an endless amount of it, and that's the exact basis of this field, is that there are too many situations to have a set moral standard. One of the best ways which I've actually heard this explained, and it was by a situationist at a school, much like this one, and he explained the rules in sports. Rules are like punting on fourth down or taking a pitch when the count is 3-1. These are the rules that most wise players go by, but at the same time, these are not unbreakable rules. And the most wisest and the best of all players know when to ignore these rules. Of course, these decisions and the definition of the most loving action in the situation has got to correlate somewhat with those of society and the community that you're in. As for love, it has to be preferential. That is, it must make estimates. In the case of the physician having to make the decision of giving the last unit of blood in the hospital to a young woman, mother of 3, or to an old Skid Row drunk, the opponents would argue that love is impartial. I don't feel that there's any partiality in choosing many over the few. In another comparison, a legalistic approach would never comfort the British intelligence staff in World War II by sending back many women agents back to Nazi Germany to certain arrest and death in order to keep the secret that they had broken the German code, which would be one step closer to ending the war. A situational approach would easily approve this decision. I want to make it abundantly clear that I acknowledge that law and order are not only necessary, but are good, but only whenever and whoever they promote the best interests of love. I feel that we have a moral obligation to obey civil law for order's sake, while at the same time we have a moral obligation to be situational, even when it disobeys law for love's sake. I cannot necessarily command you to feel love for someone, but I do feel that it is feasible to command you to deal with them lovingly. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. And next up, we'll have Clarence Taro.
Well, this is something that I've done many, many times. Been on the Chautauqua circuit and made most of my money and rebuilt my career on the lecture circuit, so I feel fairly comfortable here today. I hope I can continue to do so as well as I've done in the past. And I'd just like to open by remarking about my colleague up here, Mr. Churchill. One of my favorite lines, not one of mine, one of his, is that, and I'm surprised in the time that he had here today that he didn't use it. He at one point said that he couldn't speak for 20 minutes. He wasn't prepared to do that, and instead he would talk for 2 hours. And I've often thought of that, particularly in my case, where I've had a couple of trials where my summation ran to 11 hours, and I would pride myself on saying that I had the audience, that is the jury, in the palm of my hand that entire time, and when it was all over, why the verdict came in not guilty, and I'd heard those words many times before. I was born in Ashtabula, Ohio, to a pair of free-thinker parents that I guess you could say that they were really anti-everything, and certainly they were anti-religion, as I was all my life. In fact, my favorite expression is that the end of wisdom is the fear of God, and the beginning of wisdom is doubt. I've also been accused of being an agnostic or an atheist, but there's a difference between being an agnostic and an atheist. I mean, I felt that agnostic is a better word for me. I'm not convinced that it's any easier to prove there isn't a God than there is one, and so that's what makes me an agnostic. And I've also been accused of being quite profane, but I don't just swear for the hell of it. I figure that, you know, there are just a very great limitation in the words that we have to express ourselves, and I don't think that we should avoid using the ones that we think are appropriate at the time. My parents were really free thinkers, and really had a tremendous effect on my life. And I went away to school, and I finally went to 1 year of college, and was asked to become a school teacher in the community. And I did that for about 5 years. And I taught my students to be free thinkers too. We didn't read from the McGuffey Reader. We read from, strong stuff. And about that time, I could see that this was too limiting for me here in Ashtabula, and I decided that I would pursue the career in law. And I did that because of hard work. That was my success. The hard work that I had experienced had convinced me that I didn't want to do it the rest of my life, and so I wanted to become an attorney. And I did go to 1 year of law school at the University of Michigan, and that convinced me that that was enough of that. And I quit law school and went to work as an apprentice, I guess you could say, with an attorney. And I never did finish law school, but I passed the bar. Whoa, scary stuff. I passed the bar and started practicing law in Ashtabula, but it didn't take me long to realize that this was pretty limiting. And I moved rather courageously with my new wife to Chicago. And after a short time in Chicago, trying to develop a clientele, I did a lot of lecturing and debating in the various venues in Chicago, and finally got quite a reputation, and my practice picked up. And finally, I got to be the attorney for the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, one of their attorneys, of course. And then along came a strike by the American Railroad Union, and they asked me to represent them. And that was the last time that I represented a corporation. I represented the union, and I lost that appeal. And I think that's one of the few, if not the only one, that I've lost in many, many years. I must say that the main thing that drives me is my desire to represent the little person, the underdog. I've tried very hard all my life to do that, and I think I've done it quite successfully most of the time, but that doesn't mean that I don't believe the rich have rights. And if you recall, I represented some very wealthy people to save the lives of their children in the Leopold Loeb event in Chicago. But I won't say that there aren't some people that I don't really look forward to seeing. In fact, I won't say that I wish people ill, that I dislike, that I've crossed swords with, but there are some obituaries that I read with a lot more satisfaction than others. My biggest problem with the world as it is that there is far too much emphasis on the value of property and not enough emphasis on the value of human beings. And all my life, if I had one thing that I really strived to accomplish, was to mitigate and hopefully someday lead to the elimination of capital punishment. Capital punishment, in my judgment, is a premeditated murder, and I feel that that's something that the state should not be guilty of doing. One of the most influential people on my life was John Peter Altgeld, who was finally became governor of Illinois and helped me become corporation counsel for the city of Chicago at one point. He was probably one of the finest men I know. He and Eugene Debs were the most influential people on my life. Really, people with compassion, with mercy, and with great love of human beings, and very straightforward. And they really helped me along in my career to do the same thing, I hope, for the rest of my life. I never really, even though I ran for Congress once and lost, I ran for the legislature and won, both times as a Democrat. However, I don't really feel that I have a party affiliation, and I certainly don't have any particular political philosophy. I would say that I'm not really a socialist. On the other hand, I think perhaps it's better for the government to own the railroads than the railroads to own the government. Don't you think that that's a better arrangement? And so that's the way that I have approached my political philosophy. There have been a number of very famous trials that I've taken care of over the years, and I would hope that we can deal with some of the questions that you have about those. I'll just run through them very quickly because I think that they bear discussion perhaps later on. The first big one was the Pullman Strike that I handled in Chicago, which was just a horrendous condition. And if you have any idea of what working conditions were like in the mid-19th century and later 19th century, these were deplorable conditions where people worked for a pittance. They worked for less than was enough money to sustain life. And they were subjected by the corporations to unbelievable conditions, making them buy from the company store and keeping them indebted to all of the parts of the corporation their entire lives, and then turning them out without any compensation or whatever. It was unbelievable conditions that I fought all my life to correct. However, late in my life, I didn't do much of that anymore. I became more famous, perhaps, as a criminal defense lawyer. And it was in that role that I probably attained my greatest fame. And at one point, I must share with you, at one point, when I was at the peak of my fame, I enjoyed some, really great moments outside the courtroom. I was invited to speak to the National Association of Manufacturers. And at that point, I came to their dinner, and I was on the dais, and all of these people in their black ties and so forth, and me in my rumpled suit, which most people considered that I slept in considerably most of the time. And when I was introduced, I got up to the microphone, and here were the rich of the world standing in front of me, and I was sitting in front of me. And I said, my subject for tonight will be down with the rich. And I gave it to them really well, and they took it like little men. One of my favorite things is to write. I did a lot of writing, and we're running out of time. Okay. I did a lot of writing, and in I wrote an autobiography. And in the autobiography, one of my associates said to me, Clarence, you didn't put in any, in your autobiography, you didn't put anything about your love life. He said, you should have at least written a chapter. I said, well, a chapter wouldn't have been enough. I could have written a whole library about that. I was married twice. And my second time, I was married for 40 years. And Ruby was one of the great people in my life, too. So I guess we'll just have to end it there. If you want to hear about some of the trials, well, talk about it later.
Thank you, Mr. Taro. And our final speaker today will be Thomas Jefferson.
Good afternoon, and thank you. To my chagrin would be to follow Mr. Taro, someone who can give a summation in 11 hours. And during my life, I have never once, or in total of all of my public speaking, has totaled 11 hours. My strength has always been in my organization and the essays that I've written. But first, I'd like to apologize for not arriving at my earlier scheduled speaking date. Difficulties of travel, family obligations, and local matters, which seemed much more important at the time, have detained my journey here today. I've been asked to talk for a few moments about what I've seen as the great accomplishments of my life, as well as some of the disappointments. What I envision may be much more the everyday life that I have led, and not the accomplishments that many of you would deem more notable. As many of you know, my personal pride is the great institution of Central College, which has today been endowed by the state of Virginia as its great university. Much of my time and efforts in greater life have been to establish education and a university such as this in my home state of Virginia. One of my greatest regrets is the time my public life has taken to compromise my family life. As Abigail Adams reminded me upon the arrival of my daughter Polly in England during my tenure as the ambassador to France, your daughter is 4 years old and does not recognize you. Many times during my life, my dedication to establishing a great country here has compromised the time that I felt I should have been spending with my family, with my wife, who was pregnant 6 times, but we only had 2 children live to adulthood. Other members of the committee that were charged with writing the Declaration of Independence know of my dilemma in staying in Philadelphia during that time. My wife was ill, and at that time my wife Martha was ill, and at that time was pregnant with Polly. Many times I've debated my obligation to this great land with my duties and my family and to my wonderful home at Monticello. Many of my visions are just for a just governing body, which we have today in this great country, were adopted from my earlier studies and desires for the state of Virginia. An independent judiciary, which we have today. Extension of suffrage to all of those, property owners and others. Freeholders, freehold lands for independent farmers. As many as you know, manufacturing is a source of much, as Mr. Darrow pointed out, of many inequities in our society. Fewer obstacles, and another item that is of great importance and something that I dreamed of establishing in Virginia and has later been established in this country, are fewer obstacles to the naturalization of immigrants to this country. While in Philadelphia during 1776, my role in a small committee was, I was charged with writing what at that time was called a declaration by the representatives in the General Congress assembled. Most of that great document, which we call the Declaration of Independence today, was drawn from earlier essays that I had written at other times in my life. As it exists today, is not as I would have dreamed. First, the committee, one of the members there, Benjamin Franklin, changed 37 different items in the Declaration. Then with the extended debate in the Congress, the assembly there, another 41 such changes. One of the items that I did feel true to my heart was a declaration in that document that slavery in this country was perpetrated by King George III and was brought here strictly as a business and a way to underwrite the great shipping magnates of England at that time, but developed into other turmoil and other situations in this country. So let me take a few moments just to go down some of the other items in my life. 1777, during the war, I was in Virginia, serving my state in the House of Burgess, trying to develop an army under someone who we will later know as William Clark, one of the early explorers in this part of Idaho. Thomas Jefferson, I continued in the House of Delegates of Virginia. Another child was born, and for a one-year term, I served as governor of Virginia. So my obligations were at my home, serving Virginia in an effort for Virginia to be able to serve the continent and North America. During my second term of Virginia is when George Clark and myself established a militia to protect us from the Great Britain, the British Army. But as we all know, we gained our independence. The great George Washington, the father of our country, asked me to be the Secretary of State and to represent these United Colonies or United States with the world. So much of my time was spent in New York City, then the capital, and where Alexander Hamilton and I began to develop a relationship that was not cordial in many ways. But one of his great thoughts, and something that I did support, was a way for the federal government to assume the debts of the states. And as part of this compromise, the federal government would allow for a national capital to be built in Washington, D.C., which I did help to design when the time was right and the exact site was chosen. Secretary of Hamilton took a great deal of time to convince the Congress that we should have a national bank. I disagreed with that, feeling that the conditions of a national bank would further the despotic rule of the big manufacturers, of big business upon the country, and the corruption that was identified, that I identified with England, and one of the reasons that we were chosen, or we decided to form our own independence. Later, a great dear friend of mine, John Adams, was elected president. Mr. Adams and I had carried on much correspondence between the two of us and through his wife, Abigail, who was a great friend of mine. But during his tenure as president, his viewpoint and my viewpoint diverged. We saw the countries going in different directions. And for the next 10 years, even while I was the vice president and he was the president, we did not talk to each other. There was no communications, but fortunately, near the end of our lives, through a common friend, we did reconcile our differences and become to accept and understand the viewpoints that we had with each other. And we can talk of many of the acts, many of the things that were done during Mr. Adams' tenure that we disagreed with, but in the end, what was the good for the country were the things that came about. As the Vice President of the United States, my greatest pleasure was presiding over the Senate, where today the Senate follows the Manual for Parliamentary Practice, which was last revised in 1993, but I wrote in 1800. So a little vision on my part, but the vision was mainly to be fair to everyone involved in the assembly and to make sure that the matters concerning this country were resolved in a fair and equitable manner. But another interesting thing happened that same year that I wrote the Manual for Parliamentary Practice. It was reported that I am no longer living. This was reported in a Baltimore paper, which I had to take a great deal of effort to have rescinded, because as you can see, I am still here. During that December of that same year, I was allowed to enter my name into the office of president. As many of you know, that election ended in a tie and had to be decided in the House of Representatives. My vice president was Aaron Burr, who I tied with, and at that time, that's how the decisions were made. There was no ticket. We both wanted the position. The country decided that we were both equally eligible. But even though we had different viewpoints, I was the president, he was the vice president. And at one point, if you have a question concerning Mr. Burr's imminent escape to England due to his involvement in in wanting to form his own country in the West, we can discuss that. During my time as president, about the second year in my first term, there was a report came out of my relationship with the Hemmings family. Betty Hemmings was in my employ, in the looser sense of the term, and had many children and many families. We were well acquainted. One of her daughters was Sally. Sally had many brothers. They were all in my household doing various tasks. One of the brothers became a great companion of mine because he was the finest French cook that you've ever seen. Later in his life and mine, I agreed and wrote in a document, which is in the Library of Congress, that Mr. Hemmings was allowed to have his freedom if he could replace himself with an equally fine French cook, which he did, but then returned to live in my household for the remainder of his life. We should make one point concerning the exploration here in this part of the world. Much of my time with my great friend, Mr. Madison, was spent exploring the West, what was known as the West at that time. Western Virginia, Western New York. Our studies were botanical in nature, studying wildlife, so it was always a great interest of mine. Things that I had done at Monticello, 7-cropped rotation on the farm. I very much had a love for the dirt and for growth and plants and farming. So as early as 1803, I asked Congress to start setting aside money so that we could explore the West. Fortunately, when we approached Napoleon over just wanting to have a port on the Mississippi River, he had just lost a major battle and was willing to sell the entire Louisiana territory to us for a small sum greater than what we were asking just for access to the river. So circumstances have a great deal to do with what happens in our lives and also what happens to this great country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. And now we're going to take some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and Tony will bring the mic around to you.
Are these live?
Yeah, they will.
They will be when.
Who has the first question? Is this one? Testing.
They have me on still.
First question.
Tony.
Okay, sure.
For Dr. Fletcher, most college campuses now are trying to get people to sign up as conscientious objectors to defending the country, and they quote themselves as saying we're only doing what Jesus would do. But as a doctor of divinity, you probably know about the decision that Jesus made before he ever came to earth, when he knew that he was going to be tortured and killed. What is your decision, your advice to students at this time regarding that type of thing?
Is this on? Okay. As far as that question, I want to make sure I understand the question right, is how do I feel about the proposal to have the on college campuses, have them sign for the military. Obviously, in the current situation, which that is how I'd approach it in the war we're in, being a theologian, and part of my divinity has actually flourished throughout my lifetime, and but I agree with it. I completely agree with the opportunity to have them be able to sign up on campus the way, like as you said, as Jesus made the same decision before he came here to earth. So yeah, I would agree with the decision as far as the ability to have them signing up. Yes.
Mr. Jefferson, I was wondering how you reconciled your own ownership of slaves and your view of slavery, and during your presidency, did you have any opportunity to change the course of slavery or the view of slavery in the nation?
Well, during my original drafts of the Virginia State Constitution, there were provisions for the gradual abolition of slavery in the own state. During my life, as I grew older, and for reasons that only those of us who have changed our position in life as we've gotten older, when the Missouri Compromise was proposed, I wasn't against the compromise itself, which was calling for the abolition of slavery, because of the detriment that it would do to the society in the southern part of the country. Not that that was a right or wrong answer or a right or wrong way of thinking, but again, my viewpoint is that local people should have local control over the things that affect them. And at that point, there was nothing that I could do myself that would change that for those individual states who would ultimately, in my viewpoint, have had the decision to what to do within their own boundaries.
This is a question for Mr. Darrow. Mr. Darrow, I wonder if you could tell us briefly about the trial that I feel personally is probably your best known trial, and that's the monkey trial. I think they call it sometimes. Thank you.
Yes, well, as you know, this was a trial in Dayton, Tennessee, where my opposing counsel was William Jennings Bryan. And, you know, in many ways, Bryan was a great man. He was a populist, and he supported the little guy. But he was really misguided and became very, very fundamentalist as he got older. And that's where we were when we met in Dayton. It was unfortunate because, as you know, the trial turned out in the long run real badly for him. When I had what I did with him is that I put him as opposing counsel on the witness stand. And that was very controversial, but they took all of my opportunity to deal with evolution away from me in terms of expert witnesses and documentation and any kind of supporting evidence. So I put him on the witness stand, and when I did, I tried to break down this situation and prove to him that actually there was no competition between evolution and religion, which was the basis of this whole affair. And so, for example, I said, you know, do you believe this business about Jonah and the whale? And he said, it's not a whale, it was a big fish. I'd read the Bible. I said, as a matter of fact, it was a great fish. And I was able to deal with him as a biblical expert. And because of all the preparation, I was very, very strong on preparation for trial. And so I showed him a fossil. And he said, you know, this is a fossil that is millions of years old. And he said, well, you know, the Bible says it's just a few thousand years old. They've, you know, done some calculations, and the The Earth was created in 6,000 BC, 6,000 years ago BC, at 10 o'clock. And I said, well, you know, was that AM or PM? Was it daylight savings time? Couldn't have been daylight savings time. The sun hadn't been created yet. Said, you know, what do you think? Well, I don't think about things I don't think about, was his response. And I said, well, you know, what do you think? Could that first day, that first day that you're talking about here, could that have been a 25-hour day? And he thought about that for a little bit. Said, yeah, I think it could have been a 25-hour day. I said, well, or it could have been a week, or it could have been a month, or it could have been 10 million years. There was no way of telling. And I knew I had him. And when the trial was over, and of course, because of the local circumstances, of course, he won. That is to say, the young teacher, Scopes, was indeed convicted of teaching evolution, which was against the law. They had passed that law in the state legislature. But Brian, you know, was a huge eater, and he had this huge protruding belly. And after the trial was over, he had a huge meal, lay down, and he died. And people said, you know, you killed him. You know, you destroyed his psyche. And I said, no, he died of a busted belly.
This is for Mr. Churchill. I've seen pictures of you and Roosevelt, and it looked like you guys were great friends. But what was your feelings about Stalin, and if you could elaborate on that?
I found Chairman Stalin to be personally enjoyable. However, he was, of course, a communist, and we were opposing communism. He was a great manipulator of, somewhat admittedly, myself, less so, and the unfortunate circumstances faced in the United States when President Roosevelt passed away, and then the ill-prepared President Truman. I found Chairman Stalin to be an interesting person, a fun person to be around. However, he was also a brutal murderer. More important to our cause at that time during the war was the fact that Chairman Stalin, President Roosevelt, and myself, as well as Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, shared this common cause of defeating the Japanese and the Nazis. As a result, we were more willing to accept his communist leanings, leader of a communist nation, than we would have been at any other time, and indeed later during the Cold War. I found myself to be in difficult straits, and my second prime ministership, when trying to confront the Iron Curtain, as I stole from Goebbels but coined, in facing communism, which I had said on a number of occasions we should kill in the cradle, and having missed our opportunity with the Soviets, we were confronting a treacherous individual. I believe our common cause had enabled us to see beyond our vast differences, and we set them aside in order to defeat the Nazis as well as the Japanese. And what we may have shared as individuals in sort of liking, we'll say, bawdy stories together, certainly did not substitute itself for the fact that he was a communist leader, an oppressive, bloodthirsty communist leader. So while during the war years I was able to look beyond what was going on in the Soviet Union, because they were absorbing so much of the German effort, and assuming so many of the casualties. They were a great ally of ours no matter what their position was. We were willing to work with the leaders of, in this case, the Soviet Union, not just Stalin, but also of his military leaders who are aggressively pursuing his policies of conquering all the small Eastern European countries. And therefore it was difficult for us to get them out of there, as was evidenced by the fact that we were only able to really save Yugoslavia, went communist, but more of a nationalist regime. So it was more of a pragmatic relationship, I would say.
President Jefferson, what led you to politics?
My studies at university and early in my life were as a lawyer. And a great deal of my time was spent as a lawyer, not arguing the cases, but doing the research and writing the information for the people that would be actually trying the case. What got me involved in the political scene was my desire to serve my state and to serve the community that I lived in. As I did more research and more writing for the more eloquent speakers in my community and in Virginia, they encouraged me to become more involved with them in their efforts to shape the colonies and what was happening in this country at the time.
Mr. Churchill, after World War II and you had to step down as Prime Minister, what did you do politically, and did you do anything more and other things besides painting?
I did enjoy painting very much until the very end. I devoted much of my time to completing work that I had been commissioned to write before the war, the history of the English-speaking people, which was well received at the time, been criticized somewhat since. I did remain as part of the sort of loyal opposition in politics. Maintained thus far my membership in Parliament. Also have maintained my speaking engagements, which have brought me to the United States on a number of occasions. Speaking when I did utter the Iron Curtain reference at the invitation of President Truman. I was on one of those speaking tours. So I spent most of my time thus far speaking, which I'm rewarded for amply, and in completing a number of books. I believe I have 2 more to write, and then otherwise enjoying retirement.
Mr. Churchill, I was in Morocco at the time of your meeting with the other people there. Of course, we didn't know it at that time you were there. But and I vividly remember your speech in Missouri where you talked about bringing down the Iron Curtain. That was a wonderful, wonderful speech, and it was great. But my question is for Thomas Jefferson. If you know, in this room a couple of years ago was one of the original Declarations of Independence, and my wife and I had the opportunity to volunteer for that. But the question is, did you have any idea of the magnitude of the western part of this country when you had Lewis and Clark explore here?
Well, as you may not remember, while Mr. Lewis and Mr. Clark spent a great deal of time exploring the Mississippi and the Missouri and west of the Pacific, there were 2 other expeditions going on at near the same time. One was going up the Red River Valley, separating what is presently Texas and Oklahoma, and then the other expedition was going into the Colorado with Zebulon Pike. So exploration and and what was available west of what we considered west of Monticello was very important. And the expansion of the country and the resources. I saw the expansion going west as a great way for this country to grow and to be able to shed some of the unsavory characteristics that were employed and were as a result of our settling and being under the influence of King George III.
I must add to what you said. There was a gentleman who went to a garage sale. You should all go to them. He bought this frame picture. He didn't like the picture. He liked the frame for $1. And behind it was one of the original Declaration of Independence. He sold it on an auction for millions of dollars. It was a great garage sale. And Norman Lear bought it, who is a great television producer of programs like All in the Family, and he decided to choose a few cities around America to show it. And it was here for 2 days. We got chosen. And I had the pleasure the first 4 hours sitting by it and talked to everyone as they went by. And most people cried as they went by. So, Mr. Jefferson, in our time, the Declaration had a really great display in this very room. Interesting point, wasn't it? Any other questions? Jessica, I want to see if there are any other questions. Yeah, here, you have one.
Okay, this one's a serious one, and I'm going to address it to all of the above. Would you speak concerning the issue of the current leadership in Iran as to them developing the capability of nuclear weapons and the issue of religion and utilizing that technology against Israel and the United States?
Before they answer that, on Chautauqua format, if you lived a long time ago, you're taught in Chautauqua you can't take advantage of that position to talk about today. So Mr. Jefferson couldn't deal with it. I just don't want to get out of the training of Chautauqua. Mr. Churchill could probably deal with that, and also Dr. Fletcher probably could.
My main... Chiefly, we were very concerned about establishing Israel as a home for the displaced Jews during and after World War II. So we are concerned about protecting Israel, as the United States has of my time and continues to do, as does England, support Israel and protect them. As for the role of religion in the leadership of Iran, I personally some have been accused of being a-religious in the past. Therefore, that frightens me a great deal, and always has, whether that be Christianity or Islam. What we should do, I can't say. I'm not in charge. I know what I would have done when the Iraqis, and I know we're talking about Iran here, but when the Iraqis were giving the empire a problem, I was willing to gas them. We might be willing to try the same in Iran if I were in charge. Perhaps it's a good thing I'm not. It's too difficult for me to comment with any expertise on what faces the leadership today with your president or the Prime Minister of England, whoever that might be. It's not me, so it doesn't matter. What they should do, is, if it were my place in either of my two terms, would be to take an active role in deterring the Iranian government from, especially the influence of their religion, to target Israel. How we go about that would be a different matter for the leadership today, not of my choosing.
As interesting as it is, and unexpected to me as well, as my viewpoint coincides with Mr. Churchill quite a bit, in the fact of the religion as far as its role in their government and the problems and the questions that I've come across throughout my life. I began as an Episcopal priest, and it slowly flourished throughout my life. So looking at it through that retrospect, I don't feel that it should be that major of a part in their government. And as far as how to deal with the situation, luckily I've never been put in the position where I had to make the decision. But I have been recorded and have said that even in the World War II, in President Truman, obviously in the bombings that he made in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that he made a decision in his best hope. He was trying to make the most loving decision in the fact that he felt that those actions would overall cause less pain and less death throughout the war. So I would have to say that you might deal with it in the same situation.
I'd like to comment on that one. I think that what this is all teaching us is that fundamentalist religion is the enemy of humankind and is creating all of these problems in the world, in the past and in the present. And so I think that what we need to do is to moderate and mitigate all of the horrible impulses that are driven by religious beliefs in the world, and think more about human beings instead of deities.
Thank you. And before we have our distinguished panel members come out of character, let's give them one more round of applause. Okay, now we're going to have our panel members come out of character, and they can tell you a little about themselves, how they chose the person they portrayed today, or how they went about learning about them. So, and use the mics, guys.
I'm a history professor here. My name's James Jewell. I've been here, this is my second year here, and I'm in my 10th year of teaching. East Coast, started at Eastern, went to West Virginia, Bloomsburg University, and now it's back here. I returned to the Northwest where I grew up. Why Churchill? When teaching History 112 here, the second half of U.S. history, when we get to World War II or right before the United States, and I find myself quoting Churchill at length and extolling his wartime leadership, not so much his peacetime leadership, but his wartime leadership. And when I was quoting him at length, the language he employed, and it was very clear as a historian studying it, and as I try to relate to my students, that he is talking to the United States as well as to the British citizenry. And he's talking to FDR and the American citizens who were being broadcast to. The BBC was being carried by most NBC and CBS at the time on radio. And I found him compelling in that sense, and this format forced me to learn more about his earlier years, which I must say I found him slightly unsavory in that he approached everything as an opportunity to gain advancement. He did see an awful lot of action in the very short time he was in the military, but that's because he used his connections through his father had died when he was young, through his mother to manipulate the British leadership, meaning royalty, all the way up to the royalty, to get posted to positions he wanted. And it wasn't because he felt he could do some good, it's because, and he repeatedly wrote this, that he would end up gaining more political cachet out of it. And I found that to be rather unsavory. But Churchill, that time frame that I've dealt with in the past, and as the format to sort of pick them out after or about the pinnacle of their career. In my case, I chose to after his two premierships are over, prime ministerships are over, was certainly something I felt I could pull off. If I had to spend a lot of time talking about Churchill, the younger, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as fun or certainly entertaining for me.
Yeah, I'd like to start out by talking about Darrow. He's always one of my heroes, and as a matter of fact, my father and some of his friends in the 1930s invited Darrow to Spokane, and he was there to debate the existence of God with Amy Semple McPherson, who was I think she was called the White Lily or some such thing. And she was sort of the female equivalent to Pat Robertson or whoever is the big evangelical today. So, I have some really personal knowledge of his life here in Spokane, and of course also because one of his major trials and one of his greatest frustrations and almost killed him was the trial here in northern Idaho that actually was tried in Boise, and that had to do with Big Jim Haywood and the bombing of Steunenberg, the governor of Idaho, and who was killed by a bomb at his home, and Darrow defended the person who was accused of making that happen. Haywood did not make that happen. A guy by the name of Orchard actually planted the bomb, but he claimed that he had done it at the request of Haywood and the miners who had great differences with the support that Steunenberg had given to mining corporations at that point. So there, and I've done some other stuff as well that relates to Darrow. Myself, I'm 69 years old, and I live in Spokane. I'm a former school teacher myself, just like Mr. Scopes. I've done a lot of plays and that sort of thing. I also ran for Congress myself in 2002 against George Nethercutt, and I'm still very active in political circles over there on the other side of the border.
I'm Randy Bennett. I'm the food service manager here at North Idaho College. But for many years, I was a school teacher and taught political science and history at many levels and many different courses. But then went back to my first love of good food and fine wine, just as Mr. Jefferson. During the research of Jefferson, what I had to remember is he was not a good speaker. He did not like to do it, and so, where there's much research and much information about Mr. Jefferson and what he did for this country, he didn't do it as a speaker. There were other great people that did it during that time, but he did the research, he wrote the documents. His library is the founding of the Library of Congress, which he donated to the federal government at the time. There are great volumes concerning everything. He wrote into 4 different diaries every day. And so there's a great deal of information out there of his later life and what he did and what his desires were. Very little about his early life. His father's estate was burned, so all of his papers and documentation of his life from law school and earlier were destroyed during that fire. So there's not a great deal that we know about that time period. It was a great deal of fun, and it's often for a man who was so apolitical himself to be looked at as a founder of both the prominent parties today. But as Tony and I have discussed, he is certainly the founder of the Democratic Party.
My name is John Paul Carden. I'm a student here at North Idaho College. This is my second year at the school. I've been obviously on the other side of the desk as most of these teachers. I was Joseph Fletcher. I picked Joseph Fletcher. I was introduced to him by Tony in one of his classes about 1.5 years ago, and his whole ideas really sparked my interest as far as all the philosophy, ethics that I've taken. I couldn't really get myself to relate with a lot of their train of thought, and the fact that Dr. Fletcher never had a set idea of anything you're supposed to do, that his idea of everything can call for a different action in different situations, I think really sparked my interest the most, just because it deals with all the variables in life, and I think there's too many variables in life to really be set on a set standard. Probably the only problem with it is that I'm sure everybody else up here would say is that you don't feel like you necessarily give them the credit that they deserve trying to portray them, because these are all brilliant people. But yeah, I found it extremely interesting, and yeah, I'm glad I chose this guy.
Okay, I first want to just thank the Retleys this morning for the music. It was wonderful. And I'd just like to remind everybody that the 36th Annual Popcorn Forum will end tonight at 7:30 with a music concert.